Great. So welcome to the Authors Chat. I'm Lisa Wetta, the Collections Manager at the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center, located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations, located in Burnaby, British Columbia. Joining us from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation in Ottawa, Ontario, is author Ann Sunahara, author of The Politics of Racism, The Uprooting of Japanese Canadians During the Second World War. Today, we will discuss how the politics of racism was created, the role it played in the redress campaign, and how it and its supporting documents and interviews came to be digitized and available online. Thank you for joining us, Ann.
My pleasure.
So I'll get started with our first question here. The Politics of Racism was the first history publication to use Canadian government documents to show precisely how Canadian politicians abused the civil and human rights of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. How did you get into the documents and how did you research it?
The short answer would be good timing and good guidance.
And why good timing?
Well, at the time, in the 1970s, we didn't have any Access to Information or Privacy Act. Instead, there was a convention. Governments were required, or they were supposed to be required, to transfer their documents to our national archives after 30 years, where researchers were able to access them under undertakings to protect the privacy of people who were not public officials. That's why the letters in my book do not identify their writers. They merely give a description. I was not even allowed to record the names.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So today I wouldn't be allowed to see them because of privacy rights. So from 1971 to 1979, that meant that the Japanese Canadian documents from 1941 to 1949 were supposed to be able to be made available to researchers. Some agencies chose not to put them in national archives, but to create their own archives so that they could have even more control. The RCMP, External Affairs are two of those. And some didn't obey the law or obey the convention and did not deposit. Fisheries Department was an example of that. They were embarrassed by the 1970s because of the blatant racism of fisheries policy in Canada from the 1920s at least onwards, and how it was used against Japanese Canadians in particular. I have an amusing anecdote about that, but I won't do it here. So it took me some help from the Japanese Canadian leadership to get into those documents. I also needed the help of Tom Shoyama to get into the records of the custodian of, I hate this name, enemy and evacuee property. Talk about propaganda. Nobody was evacuated. They were uprooted. However, he sold off all Japanese Canadian property between 1942 and 1945, basically. In 77, when I wanted into those things, Shoyama was Deputy Minister of Finance. Now, for the American audience, that would be Undersecretary of State for the Treasury. Big honcho. Mm-hmm. I asked Friday at noon. I had authorization by Monday at noon. That's how powerful Shoyama was at that time. The 30-year rule also meant that any private collections that contained government documents would be open after 30 years. And fortuitously, the minister of government who was responsible for the Japanese-Canadian policy, Ian Alistair Mackenzie, he died in 1949 when he was a senator. And his secretary simply boxed everything up and sent it to the archives. It proved to be a gold mine of information from which you could build out and find other things. Of course, those are the days when everything was on paper. You couldn't do anything electronically. Now, politically, it was also a good time because multiculturalism had become federal government policy, which meant that Canadian cultural agencies were giving money to people who were doing historical research on the groups in Canada that were not English, not French, for a change. I got 2 small grants. One through the University of Calgary, which let me go to Ottawa to delve into the documents at the National Archives sufficiently to write my master's thesis. And then after I'd finished the master's thesis, I got an explorations grant from the Canada Council that let me spend a year traveling across Canada, digging into archives, talking to Japanese Canadians and to anyone else who was connected to the whole period that I could find. Those are the tapes that I recorded that you now have in your archives. And finally, of course, in the mid-1970s, Ken Adachi published The Enemy That Never Was. It is the most complete history of the Japanese Canadians to that time. It not only gave me an excellent understanding of the internal Japanese Canadian community, but it also was, he's very astute in being able to observe what the perpetrators of racism were doing in British Columbia and Canada at that time. Unfortunately, he did his research before the documents were released. He couldn't prove things. I was later guided by him when I was looking for proof. And perhaps most importantly, Adachi's book woke up the Japanese Canadian community. A social community was suddenly confronted with its history. The Sansei began asking questions, and the Nisei had reached the stage of their lives where they were ready to face the pain and the disruption of their youth and the theft, basically, of the Issei's hard work by the custodian of, well, I won't use that title. The Issei were aging also, and if the questions were not asked of them in the 70s, they were not going to be able to be asked. And from my point of view, the same urgency applied to recording the testimony of non-Japanese Canadians, both those who helped and those who hindered. So that was why it was good timing.
And why good guidance?
I was very, very fortunate. Firstly, every archive I went to, the archivists went out of their way to help me and guide me. At the National Archives, Glenn T. Wright became interested in my research, and he spent far more time than he was supposed to on my project. He directed me to many sources, both in the archives and in other places, and he referred me to other archivists. Now, under the 30 rule, not everybody could get into an archive. You had to be bona fide. You had to be vouched for. With Glenn's help, I got into the External Affairs archives. I did not get into the RCMP archives. They lied to me. They said they didn't have anything. They did, but a lot of RCMP stuff was in Ian Mackenzie's papers, so I didn't need them at that point. George Brandeck at the UBC archives was also invaluable in finding materials, sources, photographs, etc. There were almost no photographs at that time. The community had not started collecting photographs. Then academically, Roger Daniels, who is the author of Concentration Camps USA and a number of other books on the Japanese American experience, he mentored me during his sabbatical year at the University of Calgary while I was doing my master's. Invaluable advice, as did Gordon Hirabayashi, who, chance would have it, was a sociology professor in Canada because his felony conviction for refusing to leave the Pacific Coast in 1942 meant that he was not able to work at a university in the United States. Apparently, defending your constitutional rights is grounds to make you not sufficiently moral to teach impressionable young people. Well, that fortunately was reversed later with a quorum nobis petition, but by then he was content to remain in Canada. Within the Japanese community, I was guided by many of the Nisei leadership from the war period, who referred me to others across Canada, both Japanese and non-Japanese. And of course, I was helped very much by my husband's family and their friends, who introduced me to Japanese Canadians with a story to tell, and quite frankly, put up with me living with them for weeks at a time. When you're living like a graduate student, free room and board is essential to your research.
And hopefully home cooking.
And home cooking helped too. I learned a lot about Japanese cooking at that time.
So how long did it take you to put together The Politics of Racism?
About 6 years. 4 years to research and write it, at least write it and rewrite it. And then 2 years to find the publisher and to go through the many, many steps involved in print publication in the late 70s, early 80s. There were no electronics involved, nothing digital. After publication, there was a few months when I was in law school that I had to take time out to publicize the book too. My profs were quite cooperative in letting me record their lectures, or letting a friend record their lectures for me.
And what role did the book play in the redress campaign?
For the National Association of Japanese Canadians, it was a source of fact. It exploded the myths of national security and protective custody that the federal government had used to justify their removal and impoverishment of Japanese Canadians. It calmed the doubts, fortunately, of those Japanese Canadians who wondered still whether someone within the Japanese Canadian community had been the cause of their ordeal, had been disloyal enough that there was actually any real national security. It showed actually that the police and the military both opposed the uprooting, unlike the United States where the military was behind it. And it was useful in many, many of the conferences and house meetings through which the Japanese community in the 80s educated both itself and the public. It was also, ironically, the source the government used for its facts. I found this out after the fact, but Canada didn't have an inquiry like a congressional inquiry like the one that produced Justice Denied, which set the factual basis for Japanese American redress. Instead, some lawyers at the Department of Justice in Ottawa fact-checked my book. They pulled every document I had cited and got access to a few I didn't even get near to verify that what it said was plausible and correct. I don't think there's any other history book in Canada that has been subjected to that kind of a peer review. Once they completed that exercise, the federal government transferred the whole issue of racism to the Department of Multiculturalism because they needed a political decision as to whether redress was to be offered, and if so, what redress was to be offered. That is a whole tale in itself, but we haven't time to go into here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Foundational shift in the fight for redress. Absolutely.
And a whole different set of justice lawyers giving advice, good advice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what role did you play in the redress movement?
Okay, I'm not Japanese Canadian, so it was not my place to have an opinion on the form or particulars of a redress package. But I did attend many of the events and conferences that the community was using to educate itself and the public. But I only attended as an historian to provide the facts, or as a lawyer to lobby for revocation of the War Measures Act, which is the law under which Japanese Canadians were abused. So while I had no opinion on the form of redress, everyone within the Japanese Canadian community agreed that the War Measures Act had to go. To explain to our American audience, it was an act from the First World War in which our Parliament basically gave almost all of its powers to the cabinet. The analogy in the United States would be if Congress gave all of its powers to the president to use as he wished, which is a scary idea. So I co-chaired the ad hoc Japanese National Associations Committee that studied the legislation, tested it using the facts of Japanese Canadian history, and then lobbied, showed that the original legislation, everything could be done again. So we then lobbied for changes to the original version to ensure that no other person or group would face the kinds of discrimination that Japanese Canadians had faced. I am pleased to say that the War Measures Act was replaced in July 1988, 1 month before the negotiations that settled redress. I actually think that the fact-checking on the politics of racism helped Justice Canada to get the War Measures Act abolished, because it wasn't only Japanese Canadians that hated it. In particular, Quebecois lawyers hated it because of the way the father of the current prime minister had used it for an apprehended insurrection in October 1970. I doubt the NAJC was aware of it, but on the issue of the abolition of the War Measures Act, there were a lot of particularly lawyers within Justice Canada and among the politicians in the cabinet, like Lucien Bouchard, who hated the War Measures Act.
Important changes to implement. Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. So switching gears a little bit now, knowing that we've recently republished The Politics of Racism into an e-publication or an eBook. So tell us a little bit about how the 2020 edition differs from the original publication.
The 2020 edition, in addition to being actually digitized, so it's easy to disseminate, adds a photo essay in which I pay homage to the women who I feel bore the brunt of the racist political decisions taken by the politicians in Ottawa, decisions that destroyed their lives and community. As I said before, the photographs were few and far between when I was writing the book. You at the museum and other places have many, many more now, and I'm hoping many of them will be digitized. It also adds an afterword, which is, firstly, gives a very basic discussion of the redress campaign and of the battle to get rid of the War Measures Act. It also includes, in addition, an explanation of how the Japanese-Canadian redress settlement has become a precedent for correcting historic wrongs in Canada. The principles that were used and how they have been applied to the Chinese head tax, to the damage to soldiers from Agent Orange. There's to the pollution of the blood system, which gave HIV to hemophiliacs. It's been used many times since, not only federally, but even provincially, as a model for how to settle these wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have some questions for you. In 2018, I gave the Nikkei National Museum my archive of documents, which had been carefully stored in my basement until then, and the recordings, the original recordings I made during my research in the 1970s, also carefully stored. Since then, you, I understand, have headed up a team that digitized them and converted my book into an EPUB. Now, I'm an aging boomer. Digitization is not something I'm super familiar with. So my question is it now possible for anyone to learn about the treatment of Japanese Canadians in Canada in the Second World War by accessing my original copies of the government documents and my recorded interviews?
Yes, that's what we're most excited about. So with the financial help of Metro Vancouver's Regional Cultural Grants Program, we were able to convert the publication into a free ebook. So POR 2020 was designed by Laura Suzuki of Doodletronics and is available in both the EPUB and the MOBI format. So it can be downloaded from our very own website, JapaneseCanadianHistory.ca, the Nikkei National Museum website, which is nikkeiplace.org. It can also be downloaded from Google Books, the Internet Archive, and Open Library. So it's disseminated, it's quite out there. There should be no excuses for not being able to find it and read it. So the photos from the new photo essay that are part of the e-publication, they're also hyperlinked in the publication itself. So when you click on a photograph, it will link you directly to the Nikkei National Museum's online database. So folks can then start to explore more photographs from those collections, maybe some additional letters, diaries, and other items that go with those collections as well. And then we're also working on listing all the links to the copies of the government documents and the interviews that were critical for the politics of racism and what you had referenced within the publication. So we're hoping to compile that list so folks can explore further online and, just as the government did, review all of the source material as well.
Gee, someday people will be able to click on a footnote and see the original document. As an historian, I like that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what did the museum have to do to make everything available to the public?
So after we received your donation, our team worked to rehouse all of the files into archival quality folders and what we call special Hollander boxes. So they allow us to control the temperature and humidity within a micro environment. So once prepared, they were then ready for long-term storage in our temperature-controlled storage room, which we like to call the vault. Makes it seem very official and fun. So we then took every file that you gifted us, and we described each file, each item within that file, and put it into our online museum database. So fortunately, since this is a lot of work, we're able to receive financial support from the University of British Columbia's British Columbia History Digitization Program, which allowed us to digitize every item in every file. It also granted us the ability to outsource the digitization of the audio cassette tapes. We have the expertise, but we don't have the equipment in-house. So we're able to achieve that. And then we're able to transfer those original oral histories from the audio cassette tapes to high-resolution digital files. So this now ensures the long-term preservation of those source materials, original records, which are just absolutely integral to preserve. Altogether, it took us about a year with help from our wonderful team of students and interns and a couple of volunteers.
Excellent. Hopefully this will get more university students interested in doing archival research. Okay, how then would those students access the collection?
So we have our online database, and folks from all around the world, as long as they have internet access, can access the online collection by going to nikeimuseum.org. Or if you wanted to come in person, they can make an appointment with our research archivist, Linda Kawamoto-Reed, or myself to visit in our Charles H. Cadota Resource Center. So our online database allows researchers to explore by collection. They can also explore by item, place, name, date, what have you. So some examples could be if they wanted to look up Asahi, or if they wanted to look up the RCMP, or photographs from a very specific internment camp, incarceration center, they can do that. So we also have other links on our main website, which is center.nikkeiplace.org, and center, CENTRE, since it's the Canadian version, .nikkeiplace.org. And so underneath the research tab, we have a whole bunch of links that are available there, including a link to the Politics of Racism ebook. So you can also find direct links to our recently digitized home movies. And these go back all the way to the 1920s to present day, and include scenes of the Japanese Canadian community living their best lives before the war, before the forced uprooting. You can see them within logging industries on Vancouver Island. You can also see them in the Powell Street neighborhood, and enjoying picnics in North Vancouver. So it's really quite remarkable footage. And then we also have footage of one family story of their life immediately before, during their wrongful incarceration in the Lemon Creek internment camp, and then immediately post-war when they were forced again out of Lemon Creek, but not allowed back to their original homes because they were then sold. So then their second uprooting. And it's just remarkable footage that we have of them just trying to live their everyday life while going through this terrible, terrible time and infringement on their rights. So we have lots of remarkable sources online. We also have more that support continued online learning. So if you have kids at home, those are also great resources.
Excellent. My husband's family were in Lemon Creek.
Mine as
36 Holly Street. We have pictures. You will get them eventually. Tell me about the Nikkei Museum and its mission.
Yes, so the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center, our mission is to honor, preserve, and share Japanese culture and Japanese Canadian history and heritage for a better Canada. So we do this, we achieve this mission by preserving and making accessible documents, photographs, the home movies like I mentioned, oral histories such as yours, artwork, and personal belongings that help document the experiences of Japanese Canadians within Canada and abroad. So we house over 41,000 photographs, 38 linear meters of textual records, 650 oral histories, just over 150 film reels, and about 2,600 objects and artworks. We have over 1,000 collections, half of which have been rehoused into our permanent storage and described on our database, and also digitized for access. So there's quite a bit of work being done. We're constantly working. We're also constantly receiving new donations as well. So it's an ongoing workflow.
Good.
Yeah.
Well,
and then
it certainly seems easier to do it now than when I did it.
That's right. Yeah, because included in these collections are items such as land deeds for property that was owned before the war, and that would be integral to research and understanding life beforehand, diaries that document the life experiences of people, photo albums, autograph albums, artwork that was also made during the forced internment and incarceration of the community. And of course, business and community-led association records, which are so important to document the movement and political activism within the community. And then we have rare books, other publications, and of course, research records like your own.
A one-stop shop.
One-stop shop. That's right. So I believe now we move to the live Q&A portion. So we'll end it here. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Hi, Anne.
Hello. It's very weird watching oneself.
I was thinking the same thing, but so great that we could pre-record that segment and then jump right in here to the live Q&A portion. Takes the pressure off a little bit, which is nice. So we do have a few questions coming in already, as well as a few comments, which I'll read through here. So starting off from Cam, he reads, "The Politics of Racism is a seminal book. In the intervening years, would Anne have liked to add or take out material?"
Good question. I don't think I'd take anything out. There are things I have discovered since that I would have liked to have expanded. Quite frankly, instead of going on to law school and the rest of my career, I could have spent the rest of my life just taking every paragraph and expanding it into either a paper or a book, or every chapter into a book. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of work that can be done. It's an overview. It's not sort of the greatest of details, but yeah, I certainly I could easily have added. In fact, controlling that was part of making sure 2020 didn't get too long.
Absolutely. I think there's so many components within the publication that could be enhanced now, especially knowing that the availability of documents and records around that time period are just becoming more and more accessible, not only from within the government perspective, but people are unearthing them from their own homes and pulling them out of storage and realizing what's there.
Yeah, my nightmare would be that some younger person comes into a home after somebody's died and just says, this stuff's not important. I truly hope that the Japanese Canadian community is busy telling people, don't throw anything out.
Don't throw it out, call me.
Looked at it.
That's right. Call me at the museum. I'll help you. One of the integral chapters within your publication is around repatriation. So the forced exile of Canadian citizens from Canada and being forced out back to Japan. I know in previous conversations between you and I, we had talked about the women's role in that component of history. And I was wondering if you just wanted to touch upon that a little bit.
Okay, in fighting the attempt to deport Japanese Canadians, the government ran into a stumbling block when there was a lawsuit brought by a group of very careful and well-meaning people that basically probably didn't have much hope because of the breadth of the War Measures Act, which meant that basically the government could do almost anything it wanted to. It had already turned its back on Parliament's wish in order to deport Japanese Canadians. But they were brought up sharply because 22 Nisei women who were married to Issei refused to sign for repatriation, which of course it wasn't their patria. Japan wasn't their patria, even if they, because of the date of their birth, were entitled to citizenship there, like my mother-in-law. 22 of them, including my mother-in-law, refused to sign. And that gave the justices, 5 of the justices on the Supreme Court of Canada, the grounds on which to say to the federal government, yes, you can deport those who've signed for repatriation, but you cannot deport their unwilling wives and children. By 1946 into 47, when this came down, it was beginning to be obvious to the federal government that deporting people, especially Canadian-born people, against their will was not a good idea politically. It was helped by the fact that Ian Mackenzie, the architect of the Canadian policy, fell out of disfavor at that time over a very vain matter. He had expected to be made to be honored in the New Year's honors list, and he wasn't. And he made the mistake of not sucking up to Prime Minister King. So anyway, so that halted deportation and made it so that they had to allow people who had signed to stay, because most people had signed because they had nowhere to go. They had no possibility of earning a living. It was totally hostile for them, they thought, elsewhere. They were seeing what was happening in the United States in 1946 and the opposition Japanese Americans were facing as they moved back to the coast. They wanted just to hide in the BC mountains until everything was done and over with. But it resulted in what I call the second uprooting, the movement of people from the BC camps east, and several hundred from the Alberta beet fields east, because Alberta was being quite unreasonable at that time. We discussed that some other time. My husband's family's typical. They went from Lemon Creek through a former POW camp in northwestern Ontario to a logging camp where they worked for a couple of years, and then moved south to London, Ontario, where my husband grew up. They survived.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a common story of, having multiple temporary homes, if you can even call them that, between the point of the end of the war, when the internment camps or incarceration sites started to close down, and not being able to go back home because BC was still restricting the movement, back to the coast, and all their property was gone. Everything
All
was
their property was gone. I, by the way, never used the term internment camp. You cannot intern a citizen.
That's right.
You can only intern an alien. I'm a bit pedantic about it. I call them detention centers because officially Japanese Canadians were detained at the pleasure of the Minister of Justice. It's the equivalent to the status of someone who is committed to an asylum. They are, in our system, detained at the pleasure of the Lieutenant Governor of a province in order to keep them in custody until they're deemed safe to be released.
Mm-hmm. And it does bring up for a bigger conversation around euphemisms and how the Canadian government was using terms that you may still come across, especially in the oral histories, when people have lived through those experiences and they say they were evacuated from the coast. Well, we know that is not the case. They're not evacuated. They weren't, being evacuated in any sort of means. They're being forcibly removed. But euphemisms play a huge role in the historical documents and our understanding of those injustices now. You could write a whole book about that. Yeah.
Mind you, that's nothing new. Just listen today to the euphemisms, to the misrepresentations, to the lies, the same lies, very similar lies today that were told back in the 30s about Japanese Canadians are being told today about others. So, plus que ça change, plus que c'est pareil, as our Francophone colleagues say.
I'm just going through the other questions here that we have. So we mentioned in our pre-recorded session the RCMP archives and the files there. So Mia Russell says, I've heard that the RCMP archives were destroyed, but don't know the specifics. Would love to hear more about that.
Well, I doubt they were destroyed. The RCMP doesn't destroy things. And in addition to which, about 15 years ago, when my husband was working with the RCMP, he was at the Canadian Police College here and was a civilian member of the RCMP. The RCMP archivist offered him the opportunity to go into the RCMP archives on Japanese Canadian issues, etc. So they exist, and I'm sure they still exist, because it would be contrary to the Archive Act of Canada to destroy them. Actually, and there'd be some fascinating stuff in there too, because there were a number of RCMP officers who were excellent observers. A lot of the information I got on beat work, or on the organizing of the beat workers and the issues with respect to beat workers in Alberta, come directly from reports by an RCMP officer there who was a natural anthropologist. Super observant, really good guy. And I'd love to have read all of his reports, but I was told they didn't exist. And at the time I had neither as I said, if I'd spent the rest of my life turning every paragraph in Politics of Racism into a paper or a book, I might well have pursued that and used anything I could to pursue it. But in those days, under the 30-year rule, if they didn't want to let you in, you didn't get in.
The RCMP records as well, knowing that they contain a lot of personal information about those individuals, and perhaps not accurate information either. They're, from what I know, within the National Archives, so Library and Archives Canada, but every file that you request access to must be reviewed first by an archivist to deem it worthy to be opened for access. And depending on the file, you may also have to prove that you're a family member or that individual on who the record is about. So they hopefully will be there. Hopefully will be accessible in the future. But yeah, so a little bit of information.
Interesting, there is one source that doesn't have the privacy restrictions on it.
Mm-hmm.
When the custodian of enemy and evacuee property, it's papers, what was left of them, notwithstanding the 6 tons of them that they burned, were put on microfilm. The minister's letter putting them in the archives basically put them in open. So if you have your family name, you can get your family record. It's even faster if you even have the number that was on the identity card of the head of the family to get into it and find it.
That's right. And now with the Landscapes of Injustice project, in which the museum is partnered on through the University of Victoria, they've finally received the digitized copies of all of those case files, and are working on making them publicly accessible. And I was fortunate enough to be able to request my family case file, and just a whirlwind to go through and actually read the information, of course documented from the government's eyes and not from my own family. But just heartbreaking to see that they were requesting money from their own bank accounts, because it was all frozen, to buy winter clothes for their children, and access was denied. So the amount of information in those files would be integral to understand a little bit more about the experiences in that time.
And if they had accepted welfare to buy those clothes, then they would have had to pay them back out of the proceeds from the sale of their properties, which is why dispossession, which the Japanese Americans had to some extent, but Japanese Americans were protected by the fact that a lot of their property was in the name of the Nisei. And as American citizens, they could not be deprived of their property without due process. A lot was lost to unpaid taxes and other due process. But they at least had something to go back to. Nothing was left after the custodian of enemy property. Well, after Ian Mackenzie managed to get the legal basis of how the custodian operated changed so that he could sell everything off. And after a minister in the government of that time, appointed as a judge in the federal court, obstructed the law case against it until after everything was sold off. Oh, there's
the timing.
There's all sorts of stuff there for any of you students out there who want a paper. There's all sorts of stuff.
That's right. That's right. Yes. So Mia also says, in the US, documents uncovered in the archives showed what the government was suppressing to justify the incarceration. Were there any bombshell discoveries in Canada?
What there was in Canada were very clear statements by both the RCMP's senior people and senior people in the military saying, this is not a national security matter. In fact, contrary to the United States, our military refused to uproot Japanese Canadians, or at least the minister in charge, National Defense did. They said they could not spare military personnel from their obligations overseas and within Canada to do it. And that's why the RCMP ended up being the ones who were the notional authority, although it was civilian groups, the British Columbia Security Commission, which was a civilian agency, and probably equivalent to the War Relocation Authority, or and later the Department of Labor in Ottawa, that was responsible for the bureaucratic side of the Japanese Canadian uprooting.
Another comment here from Hanako. In the US, the government allowed renunciants who were sent to Japan to return to the US. Was there a similar program where JCs were allowed to return to Canada? Were there folks who did not return?
Yes and no. The curious thing about it is the people who were deported were not actually deported. They were transported to Japan, but not legally deported because none of the official bureaucratic things were done to strip them of, make them officially deported, which meant that if they could afford to get themselves back, they could get back. That often meant that family in Canada did things like mortgage their house in order for them to pay it. I also know of the case of George Soruda, who was president of the Japanese Association in Edmonton for a number of years, was a captain in the Canadian Army at the time. He told me that he got back because he worked for the US Army during Korea. And when they found out he was Canadian and wanted to go back to Canada, they took up a collection and bought his ticket home.
Wow.
But you had to get back yourself. Canadian government was repatriating Hakujin, whites from that were trapped in Japan. They were not repatriating Canadians of Japanese ancestry. Certainly, it was almost very, very difficult before 1949 to get back. Most people arrived back after 1949, or in George's case, in the early 50s, because, of course, the Korean War was 50-51.
And we see other instances where Japanese Canadians who were in Japan, because they were deported in that sense, they also signed up to be part of the Canadian military to fight within the Korean Army as well. So we do have a number of wonderful individuals who are part of the Canadian veterans, and they knew that their way back to Canada was through those doors. So, and then once they returned, they were slowly able to pay the way to bring their families, whether they be siblings, parents, aging grandparents, and bring them back. But others did stay. So quite a few did stay.
Others either couldn't come back. I have often wondered, and I have hinted to a researcher at the National Archives to look into this. One of the groups that was sent to Japan, deported to Japan, were the orphaned children. They were sent, they're orphans. They were sent from one set of nuns in Saskatchewan where they had been put for the war to another set of nuns in Japan. I'm quite sure none of them spoke Japanese. Yeah. I have no idea what their fate is, and that would be a very, very interesting thing to
and very troubling as well, that history, because they would have been taken from orphanages in the BC province and forced out because they were deemed a threat. How, I have no idea, but just remarkable stories there and heartbreaking stories, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Let's see here. So going through the comment side, we had Carolyn mentions the Emergencies Act that replaced the War Measures Act is still in place today. And there was recently some buzz around maybe invoking it around March and April because of the pandemic. So Anne, as someone who had worked with the Emergencies Act, do you have any thoughts or comments on that? It's getting a bit political, but.
No. Actually, the reason the Emergencies Act is, it's interesting. It is only an act of parliament, which means it can be abolished at any time by any parliament, which is a weakness. Its strength and is the reason why it has not been used since it was made in 1988. And the strength is that we got so many checks and balances put in it. If you evoke it, you have to have inquiries afterwards. You have to make sure no one was abused. You have to, Parliament can supervise what you're doing. There are a number of checks and balances in there. It's got express prohibitions against discrimination on any of the Section 15, sorry, for the Americans, equality rights provisions. It has not been used because of all the checks and balances built into it. The War Measures Act itself should only have been used in war and apprehended insurrection. This is supposed to be, in international law, you can't use an act like that until the regular methods of governing have failed. That has never happened in Canadian history. That has never happened in American history. So there is no need for emergency legislation when your normal ways of operating, your normal institutions are working. In international law, it's not valid unless there is a significant failure. And that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been used for COVID-19. That and the fact that for the kind, they've got 4 different kinds of emergencies in it. For the kind of emergency that COVID's involved with, a public health emergency, you'd have to have the approval of the legislature, basically, of each province in order to do it in that province. Now, our provinces have been cooperating very nicely with the federal government throughout COVID. Everybody's been quite reasonable. And if you can do it by agreement, why do it by compulsion?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have another question here from Ken Mochisuki. Anne, your book resembles that of Michi Nishira Wagland's Year of Infamy. Were you familiar with Wagland's book while you were writing yours?
Not while I was writing it, but I had read it over some time in the years, through those years. Although I do have to say, Ken, it's actually been about 35 years since I was actively an historian studying Japanese Canadian stuff. I got so angry writing politics of racism that I went to law school. And if you know any lawyers, you'll know how that takes over your life.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Just scrolling through. Mia says, I'd love to hear what some of Lisa's favorite collections are. I love digging into the archives. Well, as someone who looks after over 1,000 collections, it's really hard to pick favorites. But I would say the oral histories are absolutely a gold mine. And we've partnered with Simon Fraser University to host our oral history audio files onto their library website. So it's available, or most are available there. I think it's over 400 out of the 650 plus oral histories that we have. Can be heard there. And, you know, it's quite remarkable to hear firsthand accounts from people who had lived through multiple experiences, whether it be during the war or afterwards, the redress movement, and even just activism within the greater community to advocate for others' rights as well. It's remarkable to listen to those. So I'd probably say the oral histories are my absolute favorite. We do have other collections that highlight photographs from before and during the wartime, so you could see, you know, the lives of what people had beforehand and what they lost. And then it's very difficult to get photos of the wartime and all the time period with all the restrictions, because people had to hand over all their cameras to the RCMP at the start of the war. They weren't permitted to have it. Of course, that didn't stop them from ordering it through the Eaton's catalog once they were in the detention centers or sites across the country. So eventually we start to see photographs popping up around 1943, 44, but those early photographs are really difficult to find. And of course, so much was lost. So I think those would be some of my favorite collections, and probably the artwork that was also made during the wartime. Men were separated from their families and often spent their time in remote communities where they're forced as laborers to build the roads across BC, the major highways. And so they had not, a lot of moments where they wanted to explore their creative side to pass the time. So we have remarkable things where they would draw pictures on birch bark and carve rings out of walnut shells. So those are probably also some of my favorites. Just looking at the time here, we're 6 p.m. Eastern time, or Pacific Daylight Time, and 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time for you there, Anne. And quickly before you go, I just wanted to ask you who the artist is that did the painting behind you, and what's the story behind that?
Oh, this is Norm Takeuchi's homage to the Vancouver Asahi. They were the championship baseball team from Vancouver that would play in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, I understand from a recent book on the subject that they would play baseball games against Washington teams or teams from other communities, other industrial leagues, etc., both Japanese and non-Japanese, in Vancouver on a Saturday. But because you couldn't play games on the Lord's Day, they would go to Washington State to play baseball on the Sunday. They were quite well-known champions of in the whole area at the time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. And there's a great Heritage Minute created by Historica Canada. It's a 1 minute long. Promise it won't take too much of your time, and it captures the story of the Asahi baseball team, which is remarkable.
They use skill instead of strength.
That's right. Yes. A tactic deemed brain ball is what they called it. Yes. And then behind me here, it's much bigger than it appears, I promise, is a reprint of Takao Tanabe's Sumie works. So this was done in a very short amount of time. Afterwards, he spent some time in the, I believe it was the 60s. He went to Japan for the first time after being raised in Canada and saying, you're Japanese, you're Japanese. He decided to go to Japan and try his luck within the art profession there. And he quickly learned he's not Japanese at all. He's very much Japanese Canadian. And so this is one of the works that he produced while he was there exploring his artistic skills. And he's a very famous Canadian painter, well known for his landscape portraits of the BC coast. And after he came back from Japan and returned to Canada a few years later, he never picked up the Sumie brushes again, really stuck to what he enjoyed. So he gave the museum permission to reprint a limited edition, 200 prints of this piece here. And then he donated the original to the museum collection. So we're very honored to have that hanging in our lobby.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for taking the time with us today. Really appreciated all of your insight, of course, your early work in getting this publication put together, and then working with us at the museum. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for giving my stuff a good home.
Of course.